Mm. Okay, uh, let's begin. I think the audio is set and fine. Uh, yes. So today we'll be reviewing a video. Uh, it is posted on American Renaissance, and it is about the rise of women against Islam. The main reason behind this video that I'm doing is to discuss a sort of political meta narrative that is often missed. And we'll be talking about how Plato, for example, viewed the world and how Ebola viewed the rise and the fall of civilizations. And that will be very interesting uh, because it will reveal a core flaw in both a positive act in bringing a large number of immigrants to the West and a flaw in a large scale resistance against those immigrants. Uh, Almost culminating in the Hegelian synthesis argument, where there is a dual flaw in the society, both in the thesis and the antithesis. So, we will see how that principle would apply as we move on and discuss other matters relating to the immigration debate, but specifically as it relates to modern feminism or modern femininity. So, let's begin.
It gives me great pleasure to introduce our next speaker, Anke Vandermeers. She's another very, very high-profile figure in the Vlaams Belang. She's a member of the Antwerp City Council. She's been a member of the Flemish Parliament, and she's also a member of the Belgian Senate, once again proving that ethnic nationalism can make remarkable progress through the political system, at least in Europe. Anke van der Misch has been very active in warning against the horrors that are in store for women if Europe does not stand up and fight this creeping Islamization.
I will have to agree with Jared here. However, there is an interesting point to be made here, which is that while it is true that Islam is not very favorable to women in many respects, it is also true that the modern feminism is kind of unsustainable. And I think that would be a very great and common knowledge for the people who are on the uh, right. So it is surprising to present it as something else, which it is not. Either way, the condition of women in the future and also of men would not be too great, and we know that. Even if such a thing such as civil war or any other conflict takes place, a clear characteristic is that is that even if we, for example, take a single ideology, let's say Marxism, it is on the rise alongside fascism or neo-Nazism. So for the moderates, mm, there ain't going to be a good time in the near future. Either way. But yeah, let's move on and discuss the issue that is relevant here, uh, the role of femininity in the modern ethno-nationalist and right-wing sentiment.
She is a co-founder and the president of a group called Women Against Islam. Now, as you can imagine, if such a group were established in the United States, it would have some sort of namby-pamby name like Women Against Radical Islam, or Women Against Islamic Violence. I like this name, Women Against Islam. I think it's the name of a group that even Mrs. Charles Martel would have approved of. Again, it's a great honor for us to have such prominent and high-profile figures in the struggle for Flemish independence and destiny. Please welcome Senator van der Meers.
Dear friends, thank you all for the warm welcome that was given to me and my colleague, Mr. Philippe de Winter, who spoke yesterday about the Islamization of Europe. My name is Anke van der Meers, and I was first elected senator in 2003 and re-elected ever since. I'm also a city councillor, as you were told already, in my hometown Antwerp, and I'm a member of the Flemish Parliament for the political party Vlaams Belang. Unlike my colleague, Mr. Philippe de Winter, my picture is not yet on the hit list of Al-Qaeda, Taliban, or Daesh. But, Mr. de Winter, one can better fall in battle than die of fear. I have to agree with the American Renaissance when they quote on their website Thomas Jefferson, "There is no truth existing which I fear or wish unknown to the world."
It is interesting to point here that that quote, if anything, if it applies to anything, applies to modernity the most. Just think of an example, right? In which place is there the largest battle against the truth? A truth which is so self-evident that you cannot miss it. While some people may claim that it may be in the places like Saudi Arabia or any other place, the key distinction here is that the people there, for one reason or the other, actually believe in the things they say. But that is not the case with the West. The large part of it is because of a very strange form of Hegelian dialectic that has developed in the West, which is kind of cultural Marxist. Just imagine, for example, that if you go to a person, let's say, who is in a very remote part of the world, let's say a very tribal area, some island, right? And you discuss with him on the matters that relate to humanity, to science, to knowledge, do you think that he will say something that he knows to be a lie? Or whether he would be just ignorant, but what he speaks so would be largely truthful. But is it not the case in the West, for whatever reason, that we are missing the truth, though we have a lot of knowledge? We are always in error about what is the actual condition. We don't know. Perhaps there is a censorship of specific political ideologies. Perhaps there isn't. Perhaps genders are equal. Perhaps races are equal. Perhaps religions are equal. Perhaps they aren't. Perhaps tribalism is good for humans. Perhaps it isn't. Are we really sure what we really believe in? Though we have the most psychological studies in the West, we exactly know, or almost exactly know, how people think for the most part. Aren't we missing something else? What we are trying to hide? Who is suppressing the studies? The Muslims suppress studies relating to science because they believe it to be against the will of their God. But they make no qualms about it. Like creationists, they will accept to a large degree that they are doing it because they have faith in their God. That they are, for example, believing, if they believe in any unscientific truth, that they are doing it because they have faith in their holy books. That is a statement of truth. Even though that may be ignorant, that may not be in line with the reality as it exists, but their condition, that their acceptance that they are doing it for a specific reason is in line with truth. But here, if you look at the modern nations of the world, here people will openly say that they are for skepticism, that they are for truth, that they are for questioning things. Even those who subscribe to Christianity or any other religion, because that comes with the liberal mindset about freedom of thought. Yet, in this very place, and J.R. Taylor would know better, that there are truths being suppressed. And by whom? Obviously, not by people who are from outside, obviously, by the people who are in the power, who belong to the very same demographic that you are trying to protect. The issue here is that what you are trying to argue is not a race issue. There are race issues, there are tribalistic issues, but this is not a race issue. This is an issue of modernity. Because different people are put in different contexts and different situations, they react differently to those situations. To maintain a, to maintain tolerance, right, and to maintain a homogeneity in face of diversity, not just of a race or religion, but of thoughts and actions and deeds as well, will have to lie a little bit, and that lie then grows exponentially. Hegel pointed out a lot before. He said that any society that is formed on some logical principle, which is the foundation of that society. There is a thesis in that society and there is an antithesis, and they are in conflict with each other. But the reason why people adopt both and form a synthesis is because any one position is too extreme for them. It is always the moderates that rule the world, that rule their society, because they are, by a very simple reasoning, the largest in the numbers. There is always a person who is on fringe, who is a greater extremist than you. Never underestimate the power of humanity. So everyone is kind of a moderate, but the moderates who are actually in the center have the most power, and they are not very keen on following any one principle to its logical extent. But the problem with liberalism that is added onto it is that in liberalism we just don't have a problem of a thesis and antithesis being in conflict. We have the different masses of people being in conflict. We are trying to say sometimes some things that other people don't agree, but we cannot have a uniform standard because freedom. If anyone tries to say something that is remotely offensive but true, we'll have to suppress him. Why? Because we have to maintain a homogeneity, a tolerance. So we have to shut down, we have to use the phrases such as hashtag not all. We have to use the phrases such as, oh, you are a hater or something like that. When that itself doesn't make any sense, because even if a person hates something or someone, his critique may be right, but we have lost that ability because we are more interested in maintaining a sort of communal conscience rather, and that conscience comes at the cost of trying to suppress alternate views. And this is the reason why you are standing here in a kind of a fringe environment, because you know that your freedom is being suppressed by your own people. It is not being suppressed by anyone else, because they don't have power in your society. They have power outside, but that is irrelevant to your cause, and you are actually in the political realm also, in a country that is still largely white, that still largely belongs to that still largely has a population that belongs to your race or ethnicity. So it kind of does not make sense to describe and frame it as a racial issue. But we will see that she will do something like that. And my objection to that is not kind of that's racist, because but the objection is that that's just wrong. That's not true. And you will see, if you give a time, if you give enough time to, let's say, other societies that are of different ethnicity or different race, and they also adopt some kind of modernism or liberalism, same problem will occur to them. It is occurring to you first, or your society first, because you were the first ones to adopt modernity or liberalism or the enlightenment values. And that is a whole package. There are some things that you like, there are some things that you won't. That is with everything, every product that you buy, everything that you hold dear. There is nothing that will satisfy humans in such a way that it will be perfect. Perhaps God, but he doesn't exist in this world in some sort of a materialistic sense as society does. Anyways, let's move on.
Myself, I will never do self-censorship or remain silent about the problems that Europe is facing today. The Western world of the 21st century will be characterized by two fundamental problems: the racial and the civilization conflict. If we remain silent about this, it will only make problems worse. The next generation of Europeans, our children and our grandchildren, will have to fight for the survival of our Western culture. These existential problems are not new. The foundations of our European civilization were laid more than 2,000 years ago by the ancient Romans and Greek, and were under pressure already several times.
Yes, and what is common in all those civilizations? Modernity, liberalism, and you will defend exactly that as we move on. Frankly, the reason why you are opposed to Islam is not because you have realized the value of being anti-liberal or anti-modern. It's just a cope. You realize that Islam poses a greater threat. So you are compromising so that you retain kind of a little bit of enlightenment values, little bit of modernity, and little bit of liberalism. This is a compromise. It's not that by some weird miracle that the Western population has suddenly turned into trads or right wings or fascists. This is just a joke. This explanation doesn't make sense because it's very hard for people to convert in their lifetime to a radically different ideology. What is actually happening? And I think most sane people realize that instinctively that while Islam poses a very great threat to the West and the freedoms are in danger, you're settling for a little less because you want to hold that. You want to hold that exactly the same thing that brought you here, but you want to tone it down because you realize that it is harmful to some extent. Not completely sure to what extent, but perhaps we will see that as we move on. Let's move on. And the reason why you will be seeing to the viewers, you will be seeing that a random text appear on the side is because my hotkeys are set very weird by fault, but can't change it right now. So yeah, we'll have to be at that.
Throughout history. The classical civilizations of Greece and Rome collapsed because of the same problems as the ones Europe is facing at the moment. There are clear parallels between what happened then and is now happening in my home country. Greece and Rome underwent, just as Europe currently, demographic decline, alienation, social decadence, and division. The rule of law, democracy, and our social system is at risk.
And here you have it, guys. Here you have it. First, let's look at this slide. Uh, I love how it is a little bit mixed, right, with the next slide. Perfect timing. But let's look at it. So, problems causing collapse, demographic decline, alienation, social decadence, and division, disagreement, and discord. The issue with this slide is that it puts four problems, but they are not exactly occurring at the same time. First of all, social decadence and alienation occurs together, kind of together, and then the demographic decline proceeds differently, but side by side and extends to a greater limit. To understand this, right? When the people are bound by similar values, the demographic uh, identity is strong. The alienation leads to mass immigration coming into the countries because people don't identify with their tribe as much as they would identify with the other people, provided that those people share the views similar to their own. So the situation changes from what is called the blood relationship or the tribal relationship to the relationship based on views. And that is exactly one of the key features of a liberal democratic and enlightenment system. Movement away from what is the tribal relationship to the view based relationship. But if you emphasize view based relationship, then mass immigration does make a little bit more sense. Because think of it like this, right? For the left, they really, 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 really want people to come into the country who would vote alongside them. So why wouldn't they want mass immigration? The only reason for them to not want mass immigration would be because remember, leftists are leftists are globalists, right? Marx talked about a sort of global revolution. So they were always for globalism. Few people that who are leftists who are not completely right oriented in the Marxist philosophy, average are not globalists, but leftism is globalism for the most part. And if they are leftists, they will bring in mass number of immigrants because that helps their cause. So movement away from let's say a tribal relationship to the view based relationship that is a chief feature of liberalism and enlightenment is the reason behind it, which is something that you also applaud, right? You applaud kind of freedom and the kind of view-based democratic system, which is exactly the cause behind this. So what happens basically is there is social decadence, which brings division and disagreement. The disagreement is brought because there are people who hate a sort of loss of what may be called moral values. So imagine you are a person living in a liberal society and your next door neighbor, he is immoral in your mind, and for your neighbor, you are immoral. Why wouldn't you identify with, let's say, an immigrant from a faraway country? Why would you identify more with a person who is next door to you but does not share any values that you share and is actually anti them? He's actually immoral by whatever standard you may have liberal, conservative, right wing, left wing, traditional. The social decadence will all, or the loss of standards will always bring division, disagreement, and discord. That division, disagreement, and discord leads to alienation because now people are not unified. Similarly, that social decadence also leads to demographic decline. So, the final cause of any fall of empire is one of the two reasons an economic collapse or invaders come and destroy the country. Because there are only two ways by which a society can destroy, but the conditions for both of these are brought about by different factors. One of them is social decadence. Social decadence in every sphere, for example, in the corporate sphere, or in the family sphere, or in the public sphere. The social decadence brings either economic collapse or an attack by the invaders. That destroys the society, but that itself is not the cause because there's always the fight for resources, it is always going on. Even the US is involved in many countries for resources. So that is something that we cannot avoid because it is the nature of man to acquire more resources. That is a fight that we will have to fight. Blaming that does not work as much as blaming the actual cause. But why that cause cannot be blamed from a liberal perspective is something that we will see as we move on with this video. So let's see.
Even our science and culture will come to a halt because of the massive influx of immigrants and refugees into Europe. If we don't wake up, pay attention and take action against these lethal influences, soon European civilization will come to an end. As soon as individualism, mercantilism, materialism, and pleasure take the upper hand, there is no longer respect for law and order, nor for the traditional values a civil.
I just don't know what to say. You are here critiquing individualism, but you also support democracy. And you're talking about law and order. But funnily, if you look at it, the place where law and order is most revered, if any place, it is the Muslim areas, right? It is the Islamic areas. They almost worship the law because they believe that the law must be the same many of them believe, not all, but many of them do believe that the law must be according to the wishes of their God. So there is the most reverence for the law and the order actually is present in the Islamic societies, and there is no question about that. They are the ones that would most easily call themselves authoritarian. Authority is related to order directly. You cannot be anti-authoritarian. You cannot be but pro-order, because how that order will be achieved if not by authority? You are trying to criticize two different contradictory things, and there's a soft contradiction therein. Either you take the pig that people respect law and order, because the term order there is meaningless. You can say that law, people can respect the law, but the issue with that also is that if you take the libertine approach that many people take, a relaxed law will always lead to the loss of traditional values. And the reason for that is pretty evident. One of the interesting things that Plato points out, right, in his work, The Republic, is that whenever the democracy is formed, democracy, the main thing that a democracy looks towards is different interests of the people, whether those interests are moral interests or hedonistic interests. Because different people believe in different things, and they have different conditions, right? Societal conditions. They react differently and they demand different standards, and you cannot avoid that, because to avoid that you will have to concede an important point. You will have to have a uniform standard and you have to impose that on people who might not agree. That is the way law and order is used in authoritarian societies. But take away that, you will see different people arguing for different things and behaving differently. It is like that if you have no shepherd, the sheep will go astray. That is such a common knowledge. I am not sure why people believe it any differently. But anyways, let's again move on.
Civilization ends. Just as in the ancient Rome and Greece, very large populations are imported into Europe who don't work and spend their days living at the expenses of our states.
That is not kind of true. The point is that you are missing an important fact here. If we compare, for example, the work week of a person in the Western civilization to a person who is not in the Western civilization, we will find that the person who is not in the Western civilization on average works more. And the reason for that obviously is because Western societies are rich, so they can afford a little bit of more leisure. And it is not a bad thing in and of itself, but it is truth. It is a fact, right? If you compare the work hours, and it is a very key point, right, for the people who are on the left and even sometimes on the right, to point out how the work hours of the people have reduced because of technology, because of industries, because of investment. So that point does not make a little sense. But what about the people, immigrants who come, perhaps they don't work? That is also not kind of true. What happens actually is that there are some jobs that offer very little wages, right? And the people who are in rich societies who are accustomed to that lifestyle do not want to work in these jobs for those wages. That is the reason why Bernie Sanders is popular, for example, in the USA, because he is raising the minimum wage. This is the reason why almost half of the population of US, right, who is voting, votes for a party that is raising the minimum wage to an absurd amount of $15 an hour. If you take the purchasing power parity and compare it with any country, right, who is not part of the West, you will find that that amount is very, very high, $15 an hour. But for that, people are fighting, and there are many whites who are fighting for that too, because they don't want to work in societies or in conditions that offer wages less than that. But what if the people cannot offer wages less than that? There are only two options: either import immigrants or don't have those kind of jobs at all. The third option would be perhaps to mechanize them, to use machines, AI, industry. That is also an option, but that occurs at a very slow, a very different pace altogether. And that has its own problems. So the chief issue that I have with this statement is that It again is not completely factual. This idea that immigrants are kind of lazy is partly true, but partly not true. And for that, you will have to present some statistics. And the statistics are not in favor of the society whose whole point is to use technology to have more time for the people so that the people can afford more leisure time, so the people can have more free time. So I'm not sure how that works. Isn't that the whole goal? Isn't that something that comes with being rich?
The incursion of immigrants and refugees in Europe gnaws at our social fabric. The Greek knew the clash with Troy and the Romans with Carthago. Now there is again such a clash, this time between the East and the West, between the West and the Middle East and Muslims in particular. Currently, there's a growing flow of people from Asia and the Middle East to Europe. Multiculturalists
Let's go and look at this slide, for example, right? Look at this point. This talks about how the people or the immigrants who are coming are mostly single men slash Muslims. The reason why it is pointed out that most of these men are single is to point at three facts, right? Which are facts, kind of. Firstly, that most of these people are economic migrants. That is kind of true. The second thing is that it is not the women or the children who need our help. These are men, which is kind of also true but strange to point out. But that will be clear in the just as we move on why it is pointed out. And the third factor is that men have a more crime rate, right? Have a more violence rate. And so pointing out this difference that the people who are coming are men shows how the crime rate shows a relation with the increasing crime rate. Now, it is true, for example, that men are more violent statistically, or are indulged in more things that could be called violent crimes than women. But it's also true that the men produce more economic output than women, and that is not pointed out. For that, we have to pretend that there is some form of gender parity. But for the violence part, no. For the violence, like Quillette points out, like several free thinking outlets point out, we'll have to point out how men are more violent and predatory. The physical strength of men can be used in either of the things. It can be used to be predatory, it can be used in violence, it can also be used to generate economic output. Again, you are not getting something that is perfect. How will you even get that? What you will get is kind of a trade off, and you will have to make a choice one way or the other. But you are not interested in making that choice completely. And that is strange and surprising. But, anyways, let's move on further. Uh,
Asia and the Middle East to Europe. Multiculturalists claim that migration is a human right and that allowing immigrants into Europe is a human gesture. They lose sight of the fact that it's simply impossible for Europe to help the approximately 2.2 billion people in the world who live in poverty. This would have a devastating effect on the European society, and our social system would immediately collapse. 2 millennia after Greece and Rome, the illusion of multiculturalism is again on the verge of destroying a civilization. The delusion of world citizenship and multiculture play an important role in the decline of Europe. Europeans are obligedly immersed in a multiracial, multicultural. In Europe, the prevailing leftist political party has contempt for every reference to identity or national feeling. It is a political taboo in Europe to confirm your European, Western, or white identity. This normal folk reflects.
Isn't that true for European right as well? Which is kind of, let's say, also based on Enlightenment values. If you look at the European right, and if you're talking about Western Europe specifically, you know that to be a fact that this white identity thing is relatively recent. Before that, even the right was not interested in sort of a white identity. Racism or any sort of racial identity, both were presented as something that were completely foreign by both to their movements by both the right and the left. So again, a sort of factual error.
Are punished as racism, discrimination, or xenophobia, for which you can get a prison sentence up to 2 years and a fine up to €1,000. The multicultural ideology assumes that different civilization standards and levels can live peacefully with each other on the same territory. However, history has already proven that this leads to bloody clashes, after which one culture, the dominant one, gets the upper hand over the weakest. Pointing out this historical
Let's go back to this image. This image is not relevant here. We are talking about a different thing here. We are talking about how, for example, different groups, let's say, in a society who have different identities, they behave with each other, right? Whether that is cohesive or not. What this graph is pointing out is which are the places, right, where there is more peace and which are the places where there is less peace. Even if those countries that we are talking about here are composed largely of a single identity, but they have very low peace, they will show on that graph. So this does not point out problems in multiculturalism as much as it points out the problem with a sort of, let's say, masculine oriented societies with a relatively regressive societies. What we find here is that the places where it shows most peace is the places which are kind of Western, which are kind of liberal, which are kind of, let's say, modern, and the places which have very low state of peace or low state of peace are the other parts, right, which are not very, let's say, modern or liberal. So this is actually an argument for liberalism, what this graph is showing. This is not an argument against multiculturalism. For the argument against multiculturalism, you will have to show a graph which shows that where there is high multiculturalism, right, where there is a larger percentage of other races, other groups, other ethnic identities, there is more violence. That is not what this graph shows. But that is kind of true. If you have different ethnicities, there will be tensions within them, right? Because overall, there is some evidence that multiculturalism reduces what is called the trust factor in societies. So, yeah, but that is not part of this graph. This graph actually shows a good argument for liberalism, and that liberalism is pro-immigration. So, it kind of defeats your point in a very strange way.
already proven that this leads to bloody clashes, after which one culture, the dominant one, gets the upper hand over the weakest. Pointing out these historical facts and referring to the theory like the one of Charles Darwin is an act of racism in Europe. Even if it cannot be said, the facts do remain. Currently, there are several similar bloody conflicts in the world, from Malaysia to Rwanda, from Balkan to South Africa. The multicultural society will never exist. Millions of human lives have already been destroyed, and still peoples, races, civilizations, and cultures collide. In the United States of America, you have here the same kind of ethnic clashes in your large cities, which are sometimes mistakenly called melting pot cities. However, indeed, you're laughing, there is nowhere a melting pot, but everywhere segregation and ghettoization. You probably know better than I do Little Italy or Chinatown, where it is almost complete separation between whites, blacks, Asians, and Hispanics. On a subway ride in New York, I once saw the skin color of the metro travelers change as I drove by the stations. And all despite the multicultural propaganda, political correctness, and affirmative action. Unfortunately, sometimes the situations explode in race riots, such as for Europeans, the most well-known race riot of 1992 in Los Angeles. Since then, the list only became longer. In Europe, we also have such a race riots. The most well-known European race riot took place in France in 2005 and in London in 2011, with violent clashes between immigrants, mostly Muslims, and the police. Each time, the riots extended also to other European countries such as Belgium, Germany, Denmark, and Spain. More than 3 million people living in my country.
Now talking about race riots. Um, all of this is true, right? What you said before about immigrants and the clashes, but it misses another perspective, which is this. While it is true that there have been a large number of race riots, what it misses is the fact that the current situation of peace that exists in Europe is kind of manufactured. Let's take a look, for example, of USA. We know about a workers' revolution therein, right? Where workers were rioting and destroying property, which led to reforms. We also know about yellow vests, right? So what yellow vests were protesting against? An increased price in diesel. This was not an immigration issue. This was not a race issue. It was an issue about an increased price in the diesel, and that led to kind of riots. And we have footage of that available. The reason why the riots don't occur in liberal societies that often, that are not multicultural, is because the conflict is suppressed. But that conflict will eventually come. It will either come through communism, because all these European countries are moving towards more and more a sort of leftist dystopia, and there will be a workers' revolution which ends in bloodshed, or it will be some form of, let's say, a reversal of power. But in either of these cases, and we know that immigration is not solely responsible because we have seen those violent bloodsheds in the medieval age, in the 20th century even. So how can we say that a sort of racial identity is the sole determinator of violence, and there will be peace if such does not happen? Well, the point is that it is not the sole determinator, and it is not even a major determinator. What is the determinator here is, what is the key factor here is that an increased amount of, let's say, immigration is preventing the conflict to be suppressed, is preventing the narratives, liberal narratives, which are absolutely fallacious from being fully realized. Because when you have people meeting each other, right, when you have people interacting with each other, they realize that the stereotypes they have about other people are actually kind of true, and that leads to conflicts. Liberals try to suppress that conflict by pretending that all races are equal, but somehow emphasize also the racial aspect, for example, the racial injustice. However, what it misses, what the fact that is missed is that the reason why there is the conflict arises is because of a knowledge of truth. If the knowledge of truth does not persist, right? If the people, for example, the yellow vests, just took the extra price of diesel, they said, yeah, we'll bear it for the liberal ideal. There would be no violence, there will be no rioting. But the reason why the rioting is occurring is because people are dissatisfied. And why they are dissatisfied? Because the world that they imagine to be is not exactly the same as they want it to be. But why they thought that it was very different than what it actually is might be some liberal narrative, perhaps. The idea that these rights will cease or will go pretty low in the long run, right? If the immigration ceases, is not true. Because even without immigration, the societies will turn leftist, right? And there will be workers' revolution. And that is exactly for the same reason, right? Workers are protesting against the big government and the corporates and upper middle class because they feel oppressed, which is exactly the same thing that immigrants do, which is exactly the same thing that women do, which is exactly the same thing as the gays do, which is exactly the same thing as the transgenders do, which is exactly the same thing as every class that is perceived or is lower does to the upper class. That is just the class conflict. And class conflict has been rejected by the right to a great extent or has been ignored. But it is true, right? And this is the reason why it works.
Have an immigration background on a population of 11.2 million. In addition, there's a disturbing increase of the number of Muslims due to a higher birth rate. In Belgium, 52 parliamentary seats are currently held by inhabitants with a foreign origin. And there are also 2 ministers with a foreign origin. The arrival of other people to Europe endangers our democracy system, our democratical system, because it poses a large and dangerous loyalty.
And again, we see they talk about the democratic system. Oh, why don't you understand a very simple fact, and I'm not sure why anybody hasn't told you, is that democracy is actually a kind of Marxist ideal. It will end in workers' revolution. That is also not the state that you, if you are right wing, want to end in. You keep on praising democracy. And perhaps from your perspective it makes sense. But it doesn't make sense from the other perspective that you are preaching. You are thinking that if immigration ends, democracy major problems, right, would cease. But the answer is they don't cease. Just think of US for example, right? You have literally a person who is on the very edge of communism, right, or Marxism, let's say, being elected, being very electable for the post of the president. There will be universal health care for which you will have to pay. There will be reparations, but let's forget reparations because we are thinking that let's say there is a purely homogeneous society. But in that society, you will have to pay for universal health care. You will have to pay for a lot of things. You might not carry a gun. You will be in the danger of a communist or socialist takeover. If you like that, if you think that, if you have a white society, but then you can bear those things, right? Then perhaps you are in the right spot. But that is also bloody, right? Communist revolution is, by design and by definition, bloody. It is actually the very thing that you are trying to go against. But that is something that always results in a democracy. The problems of democracy that are being realized in the West and elsewhere is that there are different groups that are vying for power and they fight with each other. And yes, it is true that the lesser number of groups, different groups that you have, the better it is. But what you miss is that while you can remove the number of different distinct groups, right? Number of different distinct groups from the society, you only slow down. And the funny thing is this that these Muslims, perhaps, who are rising to the power, they will be a good guard against communism, against leftism, and against socialism, at least in some or the other sense, at least in the sense as used by, let's say, Maoists, if not Marxists. But you don't see that possibility because you don't want to consider that possibility. You think that it is like a Sargonian view, right? If we didn't have these conditions, right, that we have right now, the society would be so much better. But you are not realizing that the reason why you are here now is because of past decisions. You don't want to own up to it. You want to think that there is something else that is causing that. No, the reason why you are in this spot is because of past decisions you guys made as a society. And unless you critique that, you can't go further. That's just what is true.
problem on ethnic sociological level as well as military. All the European armies have incorporated the resident aliens in Europe, and they are mostly Muslims. This ensures loyalty problems when those Muslim soldiers need to be used in a conflict of Europe against an Islamic country. France had such a problem with their Muslim soldiers during the Gulf War. The North African Muslims in the French army did not want to fight Iran. Many were, after all, pro-Hussein, pro-PLO, and against France and the West. In the United Kingdom, they had the same problems in 2001 with Muslim youngsters with English nationality who went to help the Taliban in Afghanistan. Also in Belgium, Muslim fighters were recruited at that time. The commander who led the Northern Alliance against the Taliban was in September 2001 killed in a suicide attack by two Moroccans disguised as Belgian journalists. In Dutch prisons, riots broke out in the wake of the attacks on the World Trade Center Twin Towers, and in a large number of schools, Muslims refused 3-minute silence in memory of the victims. Just recently, following the Paris and Brussels attacks, joy cries sounded in many of the Muslim ghettos in our European cities. Meanwhile, for electoral reasons, conscription is abolished, and the empty army barracks are transformed into asylum centers for the masses of immigrants. Fortunately, history will not repeat itself this time. Greeks and Romans had mercenaries in service when the in luxury living citizens no longer defended themselves. We are blessed with modern computer-controlled weapons which can be used with a limited number of professional soldiers. This does not mean that we are invulnerable. So proof terrorist attacks, the threat of dirty bombs with radioactive waste, and the blackmail with chemical and biological weapons. Nowadays, we defend ourselves on a high technological level, but these means are only effective for military operations. We do not defend our culture or our identity as Europeans at all at the moment. Europeans became lazy. There is an increased alienation with loss of our morals.
Europeans became lazy. Is it something that I am hearing? Yeah, but move on.
And a failing political elite who only concentrates on its privileges, luxury, and decadence. Europe has, just like the United States,
And I will go on a ride. You'll see that everything that I say would be justified. I heard. So let's watch it.
of America, a politic elite that only cares about its own power rather than the welfare of the people. Moral decline has an impact on demographic of a people. One of the key elements that serve to speed up the decline of Europe is a demographic and ethnic downturn. Individualism, mercantilism, and self-indulgence are the biggest enemies of family values.
And this is my problem, right? Biggest problem. Individualism is something that was developed almost entirely in the West, at least in the recent times, right? Recent history. For 200 years, right? For close to 200 to 300 years, West has prided itself, right, over the development of individualism and protecting individual values. And now you are just criticizing it. Like, it doesn't make any sense. You are criticizing the Muslims, you are criticizing those people for showing uh, a sort of collective mentality, right? This is the reason why you don't want them here. But this is exactly the same thing that you are also trying to adopt, a sort of collectivism. And this is the reason why it does not make sense. You are willing to erase the last 300, 200 to 300 years of Western history that has been completely dominated by whites just to fight off the Islamic immigration, while holding that West is something that needs to be protected. You are just erasing your own doctrines, right, and adopting something which is adopted by, let's say, Islam, or which is adopted by the countries which are collectivist. You are accepting a major loss here, and you don't know that. You are attacking, you are destroying, you are looking back to your ancestors, right, who developed that philosophy of enlightenment, and you are saying to them, you are wrong. But you are not doing that directly, because you know that if you do that, you will undermine your own civilization. What you are doing is that you are doing it by proxy, right? And that what makes it funny. You are criticizing the very same things, right, that was thought to be the exclusive domain of the Western societies, that Western societies are rich, they are individualist, they are kind of liberal and democratic, and they have all those materialistic pleasures, and they have the freedoms to enjoy those materialistic pleasures. And now you are just going to criticize them. Strange.
And therefore also of demographics, where the interest of the individual gets priority on the sense of community and the interest of the society, arises sub-replacement fertility. Just as the decline of Europe has parallels with the fall of the ancient Greek and Roman civilizations, there is also a parallel with the place of the family in society and its effect on the demographics. Among the Greek and Romans, the family had initially a central position, and the marriage was cornerstone of the society.
A little question, right? Many people who, let's say, agree with this, right? Uh, to be frank, right? Very frank, on both the sides. The reason why traditional family is being emphasized again, the reason why collectivism has been is being emphasized again, the reason why people are singing virtues of, let's say, morality, now, strangely, going against a big tradition of a big intellectual tradition, right, of the West, is just because you are in a state that you have no other option, right? That it is not really heartfelt, it is just the need. And this is exactly my main thesis, right? And this is something that Evola also talks about, kind of indirectly, but nonetheless. The problem with your views is, and this is the reason why you will lose no matter what you try, is that you actually don't believe in all those things. Maybe you personally, right? But what I'm talking about is Europeans as a whole, right? Or even a sort of right wing group among those Europeans. What you actually believe, and let's be honest about that, right? Is in the very same principles of the Enlightenment, but you feel that they are letting you down. So you are arranging this sort of a way out to just save yourself. Isn't that true? Because just think of it, right? If you start doing all of that, right? If you start again emphasizing family values or moral values or traditional values and fighting decadence, you will have to institute laws against them, or you will have to have a strong social persecution of those people who are considered degenerate. But that is exactly what West has criticized Islam for. You may feel that uh, a punishment of stoning adulterers is kind of extreme, but will you punish adulterers to an extent, right? Uh, in a criminal case, and how that will not override something that West had already thought about individual liberty from the, let's say, past 50 years? The reason why all of this does not make sense is that you are adopting the strategies of your enemies, realizing that they are right, but you don't want to adopt those people into your own societies. It's a very strange thing. You are trying to create a very fake version of Islam in your own society to fight off against Islam so that you don't have the real Islam in your society. It doesn't make sense in any way I think of, right? And certain people try to present it as an arrival of Christianity, basing it on Christian principles. But for that, they have to point out what actual policies would you adopt. Let's say someone flicks his finger, right? And all the Muslims go back. You have 99% of homogeneous society, right? Racially homogeneous. Now, what are the laws that you would institute? What are the social conditions, social precautions that you would institute? And I can bet that, right? The moment Muslims go away, you will return back to the old ways because the only reason why you are doing it is because of threat of Muslims, because of threat of loss of civilization, and for no other reason.
Gradually, the importance of family diminished and the depopulation proportionally. In Europe, we are currently undergoing the same depopulation, which the political elite tries to counter by importing on a massive scale people from Middle East and Africa, instead of adapting a better family policy. The United States gave birth in 2000 to the idea of a mass immigration into Europe in its report, Economical Replacement Migrations. According to this report, no less than 135 million immigrants from Africa, the Middle East, and Asia would be needed in Europe in the 21st century to save it from dramatic demographical illusion it is undergoing now. The European Union is also in favor of mass immigration, although the employment rate in many European countries is hardly 65%. As a result, the army of people benefiting from our social system grows rapidly, and the European disappears in the masses of Africans and Muslims. While the Europeans die a quiet death, with a fertility rate of 1.8 in Belgium, for example, the number of people in the developing countries and the third world grows exponentially, with a population explosion of up to 7.6 children per woman on average. This means that on a global scale, Europe is the region with the lowest fertility rate. Demographic figures in the Western Europe predict no good. The European Muslim fertility rate of 2.2 is much higher than the native European one. These are very significant differences, which combined with the mass immigration have disastrous consequences for us Europeans. Within a few decades, the model European will be extinct. These demographic problems are a very sensitive topic on the International Political Forum. Family planning and contraception encounter lots of criticism because of religion and traditions. As long as the population explosion is not stopped, we are fighting a losing battle. Even if we open the gates of Europe, we cannot absorb the surplus of population of Africa and the Middle East. This has also dramatic
I will make it a little
socio-economic
fast.
consequences. There is a demographic time bomb ticking in Europe, and no one is talking about it. 2 generations ago, Western Europeans were still 10% of the world's population. At present, we are 7.1%, and by 2025, we will only be 5%. There is a creeping, ongoing genocide in on the European. The well-being of a people can be measured by the position of women and the welfare of their children. Unfortunately,
The well-being of a people can be measured by the well-being of women and their children, and that is the reason why I'm saying that you won't make progress, because you are doing the same mistake again. The whole point, right? The whole point of the loss this sort of civilization. The reason why it is occurring is because and only because of that very key aspect, right? Focusing so much on women and children. Though you realize, and perhaps the funny thing is, I'm sure everyone who is in this room is kind of right wing, and he realizes that sorry, but women don't and cannot support the society. This is just a fact. If you look back, right, what is the main cause, right, of this, all of this, right? Is it not the women's vote, right? If you, for example, look at the stats of how women vote, is it not true that women vote more leftist? Is it not true that women, for example, in these cases, were also trying as hard as they could to undermine the society, to undermine traditional gender norms? The problem is that you are emphasizing the very same thing, right? But in just a different context. Instead of still focusing on the males, you are still trying to make it about women and children and trying to relate the well being of the society to the well being of women and children. But the funny thing is, those healthy women and children can do nothing to prevent this decline of society. They will again, for example, the women will vote in such a way, unless, of course, they feel danger, right? They will vote kind of leftist, right? Relatively leftist. While the men would vote relatively more right wing. This whole problem, this whole facade, right, that you have here shows the fact that you haven't converted, right? You are still thinking exactly the same. It is the same liberalism, but it is that liberalism which is trying to preserve itself by attacking its own principles by proxy so as to stop Islam. It is kind of Sargon fighting, let's say, his version, right? A darker version of himself and trying to defeat it. This is what is occurring here. And it is so easy to see through it. Whenever you speak, right, you point to certain things and then you praise them, and then you point to certain things that are consequences of those things and you condemn them. I don't know what to say. But, anyways, we will look, for example, how we will present these different statistics that will prove my point. Statistics, or I will rather say facts. We will see.
Women in Europe are not doing well. The Islamization of Europe is going very, very fast. And as the president of the organization Women Against Islam, I fight already for many years against Islamization, because women and children are always the first victims of Islam. Islam is completely in contradiction with common human rights. The Sharia, the Islamic law, denies especially women personal free choice, imposes inequality of sexes, exhibits absolute intolerance against dissidents.
Strangely, right? You want human rights that are completely based on the idea of individualism while critiquing individualism. You want to critique freedom of choice. Sorry, you wanted to preserve freedom of choice, but you want to critique the loss of traditionalism, right? The loss of norms. Norms are always anti-choice. There is no other way. You want equality of sexes, right? You think that that is good, but you still somehow, and I'm not sure how, want to put community first. How can you have equality of sexes while there is differences between different genders, right? Different sexes. Equality of sexes will always lead to the conditions that you are seeing now. For example, the hashtag #MeToo movement. That is not caused by Islamists. You think that Muslims are causing all of that? The point is that you are making no sense, right? And this is not surprising, right? Because every sort of movement that tries to defend women, that tries to advocate the value and the well-being of women, always, right, always tries to, for example, present it as some sort of a very vague notion, right, of dealing with actual on-ground reality, philosophy, morals, and a consistent theory. What do you mean by freedom of choice, for example? I wonder, does that include abortion? Perhaps it does. But weren't you complaining, for example, about the very low fertility rate? So how does that help, right, in that low fertility rate? And what do human rights entail? I presume human rights would entail the right to be degenerate. I don't know what equality of sexes would entail, but perhaps it would entail more women in workforce, equal pay, a sort of a society in which men and women are treated equal, though they are different. But isn't that the everything that a liberal society brings? Isn't that everything that leads to decadence? Freedom of choice pretty sure leads to that. Strange, right? And criminal facts, right? New kinds of criminal facts. Let's take a look at that. The problem with these is that these are very, very vague. And let's take a look at that. First of all, honor killings, yes, they are present in honor based society. Any society that is honor based will kind of have honor killings, at least to some extent. But the problem with this whole thesis, right, of being against honor killings is that while honor killings are bad, they are still killings, right? And they should be treated like any other killings. The reason why people in the societies that are not honor based get so appalled at honor killings is because they hate honor based societies, right? Every other killing, mm, honor killing, oh no, that is kind of their actual reaction. If you look at honor killings, just in the way that killings are done, you will see that there are not many honor killings, right? They are very low percentage of actual killings. And if you treat them as killings, you will find that the ratio is kind of same, not so. Perhaps there is a little bit factor in of poverty there because poverty always leads to an increase in crimes because of various reasons, especially crimes of these type. And there is some notion of like masculine societies acting differently, but you do realize, right, that the honor killings are very, very, very small portion of actual killings, and presenting them as very different than other types of killings is the same thing as presenting a hate murder as different than other murders. Because, but all killings are about a sort of pseudo honor, pseudo, let's say, getting resources, right, taking away resources, or something else, right? So it isn't that strong a point, right? And yes, the point about female genital mutilation is a strong point. But you know about the male genital mutilation, right? Will you push out Jews too? Or would you put out Christians? Christians, the case is not entirely clear, right? Because some do, some do not. But would you do push out Jews, right? For example, because they practice male genital mutilation? And I know the argument sometimes is that those are different, right? FGM is not exactly just as invasive as MGM. But if you're talking about human rights, they kind of both are bad, right? And the last 3 points kind of stick and kind of don't. Yeah, the problem of grooming is kind of present in Islamic societies, but that is also present in the Western societies, right? If you look at the actual stats, right, it is the Western nations that produce the most amount of pedophilic content. And partly it is due to the reason that they have access to resources like better computers, faster internet speeds, better direction software, right? But to present it as an Islamic problem is not kind of factual. The only point that I see here that is actually weighty, right, is a point about forced marriages. So what we have in Islam is kind of a less amount of freedom of choice, right? And the marriages are kind of arranged. That is kind of another debate, but yeah, there is a point here. With regards to polygamy, the issue here is that it is strange to criticize polygamy in a society where there's polyamory. If you're speaking about traditionalism, right? If you're speaking about individualism, sorry, not liking individualism. If you're speaking about the decline of moral values, just think of it, right? Which thing do you hate more? Do you hate polyamory more or do you hate polygamy? One of the things about polygamy is like that it is hated more in the West, but surprisingly, it is something that offers females, right, a right to be called wives and ownership in the property of the males that they are having sex with. But that is not even present in polyamory, right? From a traditionalist perspective, polygamy is better than polyamory, and this is the reason why, for example, even in the biblical texts, we see polygamy mentioned, right? And it is treated much more differently than, let's say, fornication or promiscuity. Uh, After that, in the New Testament, we see that it has to be discarded because of new covenant, I guess. But if polygamy was so bad, right, from the start, if it was so worse, right, it was worse than fornication, it would be explicitly mentioned. But it is not mentioned in that respect to be that much worse than fornication, or let's say promiscuity or polyamory. So that criticism does not work, right? You are looking at a society which is actually, in some sense or the other, giving women ownership of the property of the males that have sex with them, and you are presenting it as something against women. So the opposite of that would be a kind of society in which you will have men who, let's say, have an intercourse with women and then they leave them. But obviously, you will have some feminist policy, right, to punish those men. So it will be exactly the same thing. It's just done differently.
And promotes inhuman punishments. Females in Islamic communities in Europe are systematically discriminated, oppressed, and molested. With respect to the treatment of women, Islam is synonymous to humiliation and discrimination. Due to the continuous inflow of non-Western immigrants and asylum seekers, as well as the Islamization of Europe, new kinds of criminal facts were also imported into Europe. Along with Islam, savage practices such as honor killings, forced marriage, polygamy, and female genital mutilation were introduced into our society.
All killings are savage. It's just not that only honor killings are savage. All genital mutilation is would be savage, I think. Not just one particular kind of genital mutilation. But yeah,
Especially young girls and women are now victims of crimes we did not even have in Europe until the mass immigration started. There are every year more than 200 cases of female genital mutilation in my country. Probably more than 13,000 women in Belgium are already mutilated. And I say probably, because it's a secret crime, which is only reported when things go wrong. There is a rape every 2 to 3 days, and the number of group rapes has increased also dramatically. In Europe, we know since the mass immigration also grooming practice. Islamic gangs, especially Pakistanis and Somalis, bring non-Muslim underage girls under the influence of alcohol and drugs and make them victim to sexual abuse, exploitation, and prostitution. These grooming practices and group rapes of European girls and women by Muslims have entirely to do with the women hate culture that Islam is. We all remember the Arab.
and at this point, it is not even worth responding, right? Women hating culture, right? This is exactly the same thing the West was criticized for. Let's take a look at history. But before that, just think of a alternate scenario, right? If Muslims in these countries hated women, right? Exactly, right? If that was correct, if that hating hypothesis, which has been used by feminists, was correct, do you think that they cannot do worse to these women? Do you think that males, right, who are physically stronger, who are in the upper reaches of the government, cannot do worse to these women? They can literally have everything, right, that is suited towards them. They can offer no rights to women, and they will face no repercussions. If they actually hated women, that thing is not exactly true. But you are using it because that works like it worked on the West. The funny thing is, there is a story, right, uh, about Islam, right? So one of the persons, right, who is hated pretty much, right, in the West is Prophet Muhammad. Prophet Muhammad is kind of said to be that person, right, who hated women, who originated all of this thing. There is something to be said, however, here about him, right? His followers, right? If they followed Muhammad and they knew about what he did, would possibly hate him, but they don't, which means that we can perhaps lay a criticism over this whole Islamic early period because they must have, for example, if the culture was starting to become women hating, then would have realized this and still accepted this. So the people therein must have also hated women, right? This is not proven true by several instances from the history of Islam, which we can see. For example, we have the record of several wars, right, that took place in the Islam. One of the wars was between the Shias and the Sunnis, right? What we know there, the early Shias or the Sunnis, right? Proto Shias, you can say. What we see there is the fact that one of the camps, right, of the person who belonged to the family of Prophet Muhammad, right, had a war with the other side. That was when the Islam was getting branched, right? And what happened was that in order to save those women, right, men plunged into the battle and died. And only after that they died, the women could be able to be attacked. If those Muslims, right, really hated women, they were followers of Prophet Muhammad, and their leader was a relative of Prophet Muhammad. Why wouldn't, right? They just put women forward and let them die. Why would they die for them? Feminists answer this by a very interesting hypothesis, right? A very interesting theory. They say that because women were treated like property and men would die in the war to save their property, it actually shows that women in their minds were property. But that also applies to the West, and that also applies. Let's remind you here in this situation, in this specific condition of the West. Because if the men rise to save women, let's say, as you are appealing, how does that not show that women are still their property? The whole hating hypothesis only makes sense if you believe that any sort of white knightism, right? Any sort of white knightry is a form of actually hate. But that itself does not make sense, right? Because if you make it like that, to criticize Islam even, then this whole speech becomes worthless. Because then you are hinting people that they should not protect women. But if you believe that the protection of women by men, even at the cost of their own lives, is actually a good thing, and it shows that it shows that people who do that are not women hating, because you don't hate but the person who you die for, then that criticism does not even apply to Muslims, because Muslims do that too. Perhaps not in every case, but in some cases, right? So how does that make sense in all countries? Like the armies are being largely made up by the males unless they are artificially inflated with females, right? So males are doing that everywhere. Like why exclude Islam from that? Because of certain policies? But that still does not give credibility to hating hypothesis. Because they obviously can do a lot worse. I mean, if I hated a person, right, I can do a lot worse to him. And I would perhaps do, if I could, if that is from the grounds of the action. But that is not true, right? This uh, this idea, right, this criticism comes directly from feminism. And I'm pretty sure, right, that if Islam goes away today, that criticism will be used again on the people in the West. It is being used against the Islamic people, right, Muslims, because they are the bigger threat now. But once they go away, it will be used again on the Western males. It does not end. It cannot end because there are obviously gender differences and there are gendered expectations. So how much people agree or say otherwise? They may say that they are for liberalism all day long, but there are gendered expectations, there are gendered beliefs, there are gendered actions. It doesn't go away. Other if they would were no, let's say gendered actions or gendered beliefs or gendered expectations, every person would be bisexual. We at least, and everyone has to perhaps accept it. make a sort of distinction, at least in the choice of our partners, but based on the very same characteristics, like for example, based on those characteristics we choose our partners. Those same characteristics apply in other situations as well. They apply in the cases of personality, because based on personality we make our choices, right, about our partners. How how does that very thing, right, that distinction will not apply, let's say, once Islam is gone? I am not sure.
Arabic taharush, which means sex jihad, and is a mass group rape. It took place last New Year in Cologne, in Germany, and other European cities. In addition to rape, we suffer also often from harassment when we're just walking in the street or swimming in a public swimming pool. Sure, there are European men who harass and molest and rape girls and women too, and far too much. But with the tsunami of Muslim asylum seekers, we experience now foremost the typical jihad rape culture, and the insecurity of girls and women in our society increased exponentially. My organization, Women Against Islam, is mainly active in the new media, such as internet, Twitter, and Facebook. We are a collective of resilient women who oppose the left-wing immigration policies and the Islamization of Europe that comes along with it. Because we do not have sufficient means, we make talked-about campaigns and actions to spread our warnings, messages, and solutions. Our bikini poster, on which you see a lady wearing a bikini and a burqa at the same time, went viral around the globe. Another successful poster, the leg poster, on which different gradations of Islamization are shown, was prohibited by court because the shoe brand didn't like it. Of course, this made the poster even more interesting, and it is still very successful on the internet, where court cases and courts have no grip. And of course, resilient as we are, we also printed a new version of the poster with yellow shoe soles.